Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about the Blackberry Keyone and see how this phone holds up in 2021. Now first of all, what I can tell you is that there are some things about this phone that I love. There's some things about this phone that kind of strike me more as a novelty, and obviously it's the keyboard on the front, and unfortunately it seems like Blackberry isn't really going to be making any more phones. And it's kind of sad because had they just transitioned themselves properly, they probably would still be around. Now, there is a group of people who still like phones like these, which I totally, get it. Like, I like phones like this too. I like phones that, kind of push boundaries and do different things, but I just really wish they would kind of switch away from maybe like this type of layout of their keyboards and go back to something like the Blackberry Priv. I feel like they nailed it at that time by having a slide out keyboard. The phone itself was still really good when it was, still like shut down. So I think that was a great keyboard slash, smartphone layout. Now this thing, if you want to pick up this phone or some other phones I'd recommend, links will be down in the description below. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now looking on the front of this thing, had that 4.5 inch IPS panel, and it's actually looks pretty dated, mostly because of the keyboard and the bezel around it. We've kind of came to this point where with phones like the Galaxy S20 and iPhone 12 Pro, these phones have very little bezel, and I think the last thing people want nowadays is a keyboard along with a lot of bezel, and that's kind of what this phone had. Now it also had the capacitive keys pretty much built onto the actual screen itself, and they were physical buttons, and that's another thing that didn't really hold too well on this phone, mostly because we don't really use those buttons anymore. We switched over to gesture-based designs for pretty much all phones at this point, so that's another thing that didn't really suit too well for this type of device. You had that front camera up top, IR blaster I guess, and that keyboard. Now, I actually like this keyboard. I think it's pretty cool. It was capacitive as well, so you could actually slide and go through and maneuver around your whole entire UI strictly just by using the, touchpad on the keyboard, which was really cool. And I think that's awesome. You also had a fingerprint sensor built into the keyboard as well, which I like. And again, it's one of those things where I think it's cool, but it is also a kind of funny novelty. I don't think it's really held up that well, mostly because BlackBerry's not even making phones anymore, it looks like. But I do miss, phones kind of taking chances like this, and I still like it kind of. You have the charging port on the bottom, and on the back you have this kind of plastic matte texture to it, which is kind of like I don't know the best way to describe it, but you still had a micro SD card slot on this phone too, which, as I mentioned before, is another pretty good thing about this phone, and I wish more phones had this type of capability. The fact that all these phones are taking away their, little features that they had, I'm not really a humongous fan of it. Now, there's nothing we can do about it, but it would have been pretty cool had a lot of phones that are coming out nowadays still maintain some sort of micro SD card slot. So I think that's pretty much mostly what I want to hit on the outside, the single camera setup on the outside as well, but that really pretty much covers it up. Again, the main reason I think people bought this phone was mostly because of the keyboard, and as of now, that's kind of a dated feature for sure. So in terms of the outside and in terms of pretty much the body, that really pretty much covers it up. Now hitting on the cameras, this thing did have that single 12 megapixel camera on the back, and it wasn't even that bad of a camera. It was a single sensor, and I'm not really too familiar with the BlackBerry OS and all that stuff, so take it as you will. But one thing I really did like about this specific software, or this specific camera for that matter, is actually the ability of shooting 4K at 30 frames per second. Now at this point in 2017, a lot of phones could already shoot 4K videos. This was the same year that, the iPhone 10s came out, but the iPhone 7s were already out at this time, and pretty much we already had 4K in every single phone that came out. But still, having that ability, I'm glad it didn't get stuck with 1080p. So I think as long as we had that kind of, future-proof this phone a little bit. Now, I think the sensor really wasn't that great. I think it's very, very average, especially in nowadays. I mean, even though it's a 12 megapixel sensor, some people may look at that and be like, oh, it's the same count as the iPhone 12, so it's pretty much the same camera. That is not the case. A lot of the improvements come with the software, and I feel like BlackBerry is really focusing in on young, professional people and trying to make their phone, I don't know, maybe more alluded to that sense and trying to focus more on their email clients and all that stuff. And I guess the camera really was another phone, main focus at that time. But this camera is good. I guess it'll get the job done for the most part. It's definitely not amazing. It's not groundbreaking. And I don't think it's the best camera of 2017. I would probably give that either to the iPhone 10 or the Galaxy S8. But this camera is still good enough for the most part, I would assume. So the front camera, single 8 megapixel sensor there, 1080p at 30 frames on that camera. And again, as I mentioned, it gets the job done. Is it the best camera in the world? Absolutely not. It's definitely not the best camera of that year either. But I think for a majority of people out there, it gets the job done, and I think that's how most it probably has going for it. So in terms of that pretty much covers up the camera. Now hitting on the best and the worst thing about this phone simultaneously, the software is one of those things that I'm not really a huge fan of. Now it's actually pretty stock. It's almost completely stock Android for the most part, which is something I like. I don't like having a bunch of random things coming up and a lot of bloatware. This thing does have, BlackBerry's, built-in apps, but other than that, it's a pretty stock experience, which I like. Now, unfortunately, it did get, it only got like 1 or 2 versions of Android. So it started off with Android 7.1. It got all the way up to Android 8.1, and it didn't go any further than that, which is actually pretty sad because I feel like this phone could probably still support, maybe a couple more versions of Android here and there. It did kind of have like a watered down chipset at that time. So it's not necessarily like the best performing phone of all time, but I think it's okay. Like if it got a couple more updates, I think that would have been awesome. But I think something that's even cooler than that is the fact that this phone has a 3500 mAh battery inside of it. And I think that's a really good size battery. We're seeing still 3500 mAh to be a really good size battery that people are still putting into their phones. So I think that is a really good highlight of this phone. The battery life I think is really good on this phone, but the software is a bit outdated. The software is not even that bad because it's mostly stock Android, which I love, but it is a little bit outdated. We're already getting our developer betas for Android 12, so that's already many years outdated for the most recent version of software that this phone got. So keep that in mind, but that's pretty much how I would kind of sum up this specific phone's best feature and probably the worst feature as well. Now when they get off with the performance, this device had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 625 chipset inside of it, an octa-core CPU, an Adreno 506 GPU, and 3GB of RAM on the base model, and then 4GB of RAM on the top tier model. Now in this specific case as well, this is another case in point where I'd probably tell you that this phone's performance is actually not that bad. It's still actually a pretty decent performing device. Now there's 2 different things I want to say with that being said. One, it's an older phone, so I'm comparing it to those phones that came out the same year. And 2, because of this phone and the way it looks and the screen, a lot of things that I would end up normally doing on a phone like this end up being a little strange. And what I mean by that is if I'm playing a certain game or if I'm doing a certain thing on this device, and let's say I have to put it in landscape mode, or even if I'm keeping it regular in portrait mode, there are issues when I'm using this specific device. If I'm trying to use a specific app that maybe has to take up the whole entire screen, it's okay. This phone can actually take up, it's not like the BlackBerry Passport with the square screen. This thing handles those type of apps fine, but sometimes it does get in the way, the keyboard or the nav bar buttons, just because I'm trying to do something on the screen and I can't really do it that well because the screen is almost like half the size of the phone itself. And that does kind of become a problem, to be completely honest. But the whole entire UI, because like I said, it's stock Android, it looks pretty good. It handles everything perfectly fine for the most part. If you start doing more intensive, heavier intensive games, obviously you're going to run into problems. The other big thing here is that a lot of apps may start to become unsupported on these older versions of Android. So that's another pretty big thing to keep in mind. But I think for a majority of things you're going to do on this phone, you're probably going to get an okay experience in this day and age, comparatively to other devices that came out in 2017. When I look at the Galaxy S8, the Note 8, even like the iPhone 10, those phones hold up much better. The iPhone 10 holds up the best out of 2017 phones for sure. But I think this device, for the most part, gets the job done. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's a great performing phone, but I think it's an okay performing phone for a 2017 phone in 2021. So in terms of that pretty much covers that up. And to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, should you go and buy a Blackberry Keyone in 2021? Well, this is what I'll tell you. I think this phone in some ways is worth it, and in most ways it's probably not worth it to a lot of people. Now this phone isn't like the cheapest phone you can buy. It's still actually fairly expensive, which is kind of annoying. The main thing is BlackBerry is kind of defunct now. I don't know if they're still making phones. They may be making a phone here and there, but they're not like the phone manufacturer they used to be. So that's a humongous thing to keep in mind. The biggest, problem with this device, in my opinion, is probably the software and the lack of software thereof. It's not getting any more software updates. So I think that's a pretty big disadvantage that you're going to be getting on this phone. I think the performance is still pretty decent. It's okay. I don't want to make it sound like it's a highlight. It's a very average performing phone, so keep that in mind. I think the fact that it has the keyboard can either be a pro or a con for you. For me, it's probably more of a con, but it's not something that I would kind of freak out about. But I don't really like how the screen is just, half the phone. I don't like that at all. I hate how the keyboard is always there, even if you don't need it. And that's a pretty big disadvantage for this type of device. Will I get over it? Probably, but it is something that kind of annoys me, and I feel like that's going to annoy a lot of people. I love the battery size on this thing, it's fairly big. I love having a micro SD card slot on this phone too, but when I look at other phones that came out in 2017, phones like the Note 8, the S8 Plus, and even the iPhone 10, those phones are so much better in so many different ways than this device that unless this one was being gifted to me or something, I would probably want to pick up, like iPhone 10 or a Note 8 or a Galaxy S8 Plus or something like that over this device for sure. So in terms of everything, that pretty much covers it up. If you guys want to pick up this phone or any other phones I'd recommend, the links are down below like I mentioned. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Hit the like button if you guys enjoyed the video, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.